The desert had a way of holding silence like a secret. At dusk, the light turned to copper and the wind carried the scent of sage through the streets of Ash Hollow. Dust curled around the hooves of Elijah Kane's horse as he rode through town, coat collar turned against the chill that came too early that year. His face was carved with the stillness of a man who had outlived his own laughter. 3 winters had passed since he buried his wife in the rocky hills north of town, yet her absence still filled every room he entered. He was known to most as the rich widower who spoke to no one but his horse and the bottle he kept behind the barn. Children watched him ride past as if he were a ghost, their mothers whispering that grief could make a man dangerous. He did not argue with them. The truth was simpler. He was tired of explaining that loneliness, once it settled into a man's bones, felt less like sorrow and more like weather. That evening, as the last shops shuttered their doors, he saw her. A young woman sat beneath the flickering lamplight at the edge of the street, a basket of woven goods beside her knees. Her shawl was thin, patterned with faded crimson threads. She couldn't have been more than 20, but her eyes carried a quiet beyond her years. The townsfolk passed her without a glance, as if she were part of the dust itself. Elijah slowed his horse, meaning only to look, but she lifted her face toward him. Her voice came soft, almost lost in the wind. "It's getting dark, sir. Please don't turn me away." He stopped, uncertain why the words struck him so. There was no fear in her tone, only weariness and a strange steadiness that reminded him of prayer. Her gaze met his for a moment before dropping again to her hands, which were raw from weaving. He wanted to speak, to ask where she was from, what she needed, but the old shame rose in his throat. He dismounted instead and reached into his pocket for coins. When he placed them on the edge of her basket, she did not reach for them. "The baskets are for trade," she said. "Not pity." Her accent lilted gently, the syllables touched by a rhythm not native to this town. Elijah felt heat climb his neck. "Then I'll buy one," he muttered, lifting the nearest piece. The weaving was intricate, dyed with earth and ash, patterned in spirals that seemed to move when the light touched them. She nodded once, as if the exchange meant something beyond trade. When he mounted his horse again, she looked up at him through the haze. "Thank you, stranger." He rode away before he could answer, yet her words followed him all the way to the edge of town. By morning, Ash Hollow buzzed with talk. The sheriff had told the shopkeepers to keep an eye on that native girl hanging around the post road. They called her a drifter, said she'd been seen sleeping by the freight barn. Elijah heard them while waiting for supplies, their laughter sharp as glass. He said nothing. Still, that night he found himself standing by his window, watching the horizon where she had been. The following day brought bitter wind. When Elijah passed the outskirts, he saw her again. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, shawl pulled close, baskets unsold. Her lips were blue from cold. The sheriff's horse stood nearby. The man was warning her to move on. "This ain't no place to camp," the sheriff said, boots crunching the frost. "I sell what I make," she replied quietly. "Where else should I go?" Elijah's hand tightened on his reins. He should have kept riding. The town had never been kind to those who didn't belong, and he was no savior. Yet as he turned his horse, he caught her gaze again. Her eyes held no plea this time, only dignity, stubborn and silent. He hated himself for not stopping. That night he left a few coins on the ground near where she had sat, hidden beneath a scrap of paper weighted with a stone. A coward's kindness. When he woke before dawn, guilt gnawed at him like hunger. The next morning the note and the coins were gone. In their place lay a small woven charm, 2 threads braided together, red and gold. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the fine tension of the fibers. She had accepted his offering, but on her own terms. The days passed that way. Sometimes he saw her in the distance, carrying baskets to the edge of town, always alone. Sometimes she vanished for a week and he wondered if she had finally gone. But then the faint smoke of her small fire would rise again from behind the barn. One morning, frost clung to the grass and the wind blew restless through the canyon. Elijah found her there, crouched beside the fire pit, weaving by the first light. Her fingers moved with grace, but her lips trembled. Without speaking, he set a tin mug of coffee beside her. She hesitated before taking it, lifting it to her lips with both hands. He knelt, pretending to study her work. "You weave the wind," he said quietly. Her mouth curved in a faint smile. "No," she murmured. "I weave what the wind forgets." The words stayed with him long after he left. That night, he dreamed of the basket he had bought from her, rolling down a hill, unraveling strand by strand until it vanished in the dust. He woke before dawn, uneasy. Rain came a week later, sudden and fierce. Lightning split the sky, and the wind turned wild enough to tear roofs loose. Elijah thought of her, of the makeshift shelter by the freight barn, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was pulling on his coat and riding through the storm. He found her huddled beneath a broken wagon, soaked to the bone. When she saw him dismount, her eyes widened but she didn't move. "You shouldn't be here," she said over the roar of rain. "Neither should you," he answered. "Come on." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. Her skin was cold, her pulse quick against his fingers. They rode through the dark, lightning flashing over the fields, until the outline of his cabin appeared through the sheets of rain. Inside, the warmth from the small fire filled the room slowly. She stood near the door, dripping, her shawl heavy with water. Elijah brought her a blanket and turned away while she changed. The crackle of the fire became the only sound. When she sat beside the hearth, she took out a small reed and began to weave, fingers steady despite the tremor in them. He watched her in silence, the lamplight catching in her dark hair. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Wania," she said. "It means beautiful spirit." "Fitting," he replied before he could stop himself. She looked at him then, eyes glimmering with something unreadable. For a long while neither spoke. Outside, the storm battered the world, but inside the air grew strangely calm. In the days that followed she stayed. He told himself it was only until the weather cleared, but each morning he found a new reason not to send her away. She mended the torn straps on his saddle, tended the fire, wove small charms that she hung by the window to keep out bad dreams. He pretended not to notice, yet each one caught the light differently, filling the cabin with quiet color. The townsfolk noticed too. Whispers rose like dust, about the widower and the native girl. The sheriff came by one afternoon, hat in hand but eyes hard. "Elijah," he said, "folks are talking. You do best to think on your reputation." Elijah stood on the porch, jaw tight. "Reputation's a thing for men who still care what others think. Care or not, it'll cost you business. Respect." He looked past the sheriff toward the open land, the hills turning gold in the late light. "I lost one good woman to your kind of respect," he said. "I won't lose another." The sheriff left without another word. When Elijah turned, he found Wania standing in the doorway listening. Her expression held no fear, only sadness. "They will not forgive you for this," she said softly. "Then they'll have to live with it," he answered. "Same as I do." That night, by the fire, he told her about his wife, the sickness, the grave, the way the town's pity had felt heavier than grief itself. She listened without interrupting, her eyes steady, her hands folded around a strip of woven thread. When he finished, she rose and tied that thread around his wrist. "Now the wind remembers," she whispered. The days that followed were gentler. The world outside seemed to fade, only the sound of horses, the creak of the porch boards, the scent of cedar in the evening. Sometimes she sang in her language while she worked, and he would pause, afraid that even breathing might break the spell. When spring came, they stood together beneath the red cliffs beyond town. The old tribal elder, Mother Greyfeather, performed the ceremony herself. There were no witnesses, no church bells, only the rhythm of the drum and the wind moving through the sage. Elijah tied a strip of woven thread around Wania's wrist. She did the same for him, their hands trembling but sure. "Now the wind remembers," she said again, and this time her voice carried clear across the canyon. Later, as they rode back toward home, the sky burned orange behind them. The town watched in silence from a distance, whispers already forming, but Elijah no longer cared. The light on Wania's face was enough. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the ridge, he found her on the porch, laying out her baskets to dry. The air smelled of rain and fresh earth. He leaned against the railing, watching the shadows lengthen. "It's getting dark, Wania," he said quietly. She looked up, smiling the same faint smile she had worn that first night beneath the lamplight. "Then stay close, Elijah. The dark is only lost light finding its way home." He reached for her hand, and for the first time in years, the silence around them felt like peace instead of emptiness. If you ever find yourself crossing a lonely town at dusk, and someone meets your eyes with the quiet of the earth and there's pause, the heart recognizes what the mind forgets. Sometimes redemption waits in the shape of a stranger's woven basket, asking only this: "Please don't turn away."